and welcome to all of you on the line. I hope that everyone is well, that you and your families continue to stay healthy and safe. We're grateful to have you joining us today for our Fighting Hate from Home webinar, Passing Georgia's Hate Crime Law, How It Happened and What That Means. For today's call, ADL's Southern Division Vice President, Dr. Allison Padilla-Goodman, will be in conversation with former Georgia Governor Roy Barnes, Atlanta Journal-Constitution Statehouse reporter Maya Prabhu, and Jean Rackley, Coca-Cola's Group Director for State and Local Affairs. Allison is based in Atlanta, where she leads the Southeast Regional Office of ADL, covering Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. She also leads the entire South Division, which includes the ADL regional offices based in Florida, New Orleans, and St. Louis. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the call over to my friend and colleague, Allison.
Thanks, Deb, and welcome to everyone who is joining us. On June 26th, the Georgia Enhanced Penalties for Hate Crimes Act was passed with strong bipartisan support and signed into law, removing Georgia from the list of 5 states that previously did not have hate crime statutes. ADL has been actively leading efforts on hate crimes legislative advocacy in Georgia for decades, especially through ADL's leadership of the Hate Free Georgia Coalition, which played an important role in securing the law's passage. This vital piece of legislation's passage comes just months after the horrific murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Rayshard Brooks in Georgia. The law reflects 25 long years of struggling to shift the state's political landscape, and it now offers protections to people of every race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. A hate crimes law provides an enhanced penalty for crimes where a perpetrator intentionally selects a victim based on their actual or perceived personal characteristics, such as race, religion, or sexual orientation. Hate crimes have a double impact, as their effects reverberate well beyond individuals and can leave entire communities feeling fearful, powerless, and alienated. In the last year of available data, there were 7,120 hate crimes committed in the US. That's almost 20 hate crimes per day. And the US Department of Justice estimates that annually there are over 250,000 hate crimes. The enactment of this law may create new opportunities for ADL and our allies to secure hate crimes laws in the 4 remaining states without them: Arkansas, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming. It could also open doors for other legislative actions that secure justice and inclusivity for all. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Having spent 25 years in elected office and more than 40 years practicing law, Governor Roy Barnes was Georgia's governor from 1999 to 2003. During his term, he concentrated on education, healthcare, and remedies for urban growth and sprawl. He was defeated for re-election in part because of his efforts to change the Georgia flag, which had featured a Confederate battle emblem. Governor Barnes has also been a longtime ADL board member and now honorary board member. Maya Prabhu covers Georgia's politics and government at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, with a focus on social issues, criminal justice, and legislative politics. In 2017, she won an investigative reporting award from the National Association of Black Journalists for investigation of public safety concerns created when a state underfunds and understaffs its prisons. Jean Rackley is the Director of Government Relations for Coca-Cola North America, where he is responsible for federal and state legislative and regulatory issues that impact the beverage industry. Jean has more than 25 years of public affairs and government relations experience and has worked for Coca-Cola for 18 years. He formerly served on the boards of the Georgia Conservancy, the Keep Georgia Beautiful Foundation, and is a former president of the Georgia Council of Coca-Cola Bottlers. Welcome, Governor Barnes, Maya, and Jean. I'm thrilled to have you. So I thought today, while we just passed a pretty historic hate crimes law, we've been at this a long time, and Governor Barnes knows this story probably better than anyone. So Governor Barnes, can you talk us through the history of hate crimes legislation in Georgia and how we got to 2020? Why do you think it took so long for Georgia to pass a solid?
Well, I will start off by saying, you know, in the South, we do things differently. We're slow to move, and that is particularly true when it involves issues of race and religion, and also the rights of all people rather than just a few. Our history is fraught in the South and in Georgia, of course, because of that background that we come from. However, Georgia has been moving forward, sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step backward in regarding social issues. When I became governor in 1999, we had a very aggressive agenda, and one of the things that we wanted to enact was a hate crimes law. And this was long before really it was thought to be possible in Georgia. And the bill that finally came out was, we passed one, but the bill that finally came out had a little too much what I call midnight amending in the General Assembly. And the Supreme Court of Georgia struck it as unconstitutionally vague after I left. I left in 2003, and the next year they struck it as unconstitutional. And then it kind of lay dormant. We had during my administration the issue of removing the Confederate flag, which was about 2/3 of the Georgia flag, from the Georgia flag. And I think there was some exhaustion, you know, that we had gone, and it was gut wrenching. That fight and the fight on hate crimes was gut wrenching. And I think everybody said, listen, Barnes is gone, let's take a rest a while. And also we had a very conservative Republican Party that was rising in Georgia. And that it was just an issue that nobody wanted to take up. But when we had the events that have happened this year, Allison and I have been talking about hate crimes ever since she's been here. And when we talked this year after the events that occurred throughout the nation, I told her, I said, this is your opportunity. You know, issues can move very quickly when its time has come. And I knew that there was going to be able to get some bipartisan support because everybody was concerned about what happened to George Green and then Ahmaud down in Glenn County. And I knew the issue was going to come very quickly, and it did. And luckily, we had some great bipartisan support. David Ralston, who is the Speaker of the House, and David, I've known David forever. His daddy was a clerk of the Superior Court up in Gilmer County. Very conservative area. David was not a Republican who came, as many Republicans came in the South late. Their family fought for the Union, for example, in the mountains of North Georgia. And he became a very important part of putting together by his relentless focus on it. He says, after the bill passed the House, that was the House, was really the effort in drafting of ADL, he said the Senate needs to pass it without change. And I talked to him several times during all of this. I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, but we're very good friends. And I was amazed by the bipartisan support that came together. And to be quite frank with you, it made me proud to be a Georgian, that we came together and were able to talk enough to get this passed. One last thing that I'll hush and pass it to another member of the panel, but there was this effort at the last minute, and this always happens in the General Assembly on controversial things, to include police officers, law enforcement officers as a protected class. The Lieutenant Governor came out with a bill. I analyzed it along with Allison and the others. I did some memos for it to the Speaker and some of the other Republican, moderate Republicans in the legislature that I was friends with. And it would have been disastrous. It would have killed the bill. And luckily, we were able, through Allison and Jean and Sam Olens and others, to be able to take that off and pass what I call a bill clean. The only change was to add some data collection about hate crimes. And that was an extraordinary effort that came together. One last thing that that I think had some effect and had a good effect. Allison and others decided that we need to assemble a group of former Democrats and Republicans, former office holders that were Democrats and Republican, and put out a letter, an open letter to the people of people of Georgia. And we drafted one, and we got 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and then we got President Carter to sign it also. And we sent it out statewide. It was prominently printed in several, in the Atlanta paper, of course, in the Marietta Journal, but also in the weekly newspapers throughout the state. And I think that gave cover to people on both sides that might be representing very conservative districts, that this is okay, that I can get out in this. And so I think that, of course, I tip my hat and give the credit to Allison because she's been tireless in this effort. But it was a great effort. It was a historic effort. And I'm glad now, after over 20 years of the time we had our first hate crimes bill, that we have one that's now effective. It covers everybody. It covers those that should be protected. And it gives an additional tool to judges to use to enhance sentences to really stamp back on hate. And the rising hatred that we see against demonstrators every day, and the rising tide that I see in anti-Semitism is something that we all have a duty to speak up about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Governor. I agree with you, and I think that letter that you helped draft and signed on to really was emblematic of the strong bipartisan effort that the bill was, and the signing and the hearings were just quite uplifting. Maya, you've been covering hate crimes for the AJC, Georgia's largest daily newspaper, for years. I mean, what were the key moments that you think really pushed that bill forward over the past few months?
So I'm gonna start by apologizing. I am on vacation and the internet where I'm staying went out, and so I'm sitting in a hotel lobby right now. So if you hear background or see people walk by, apologies. And so I would say, you know, I think this has been mentioned. If you asked me in January if Georgia was going to pass a hate crimes law this year, I would have told you I'd be shocked that it happened. I think what happened is the session suspended, and we took those 3 months off. And during that time, people became aware nationally of the shooting, the killing, and those men being charged for murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Glenn County. And I think that struck a chord with people in the legislature who previously didn't feel as though there was a need for extra protections for certain classes for hate crimes. So I would say that that was definitely a turning point in Georgia. You know, as long as I've been here since 2017, David Ralston has supported passing hate crimes legislation. Republican lawmakers in the House have introduced hate crimes legislation, and it didn't really get anywhere until last year when you saw it make it through the House and then just kind of stall and sit in the Senate. And so, like, you know, he had always been for this, but when this killing of Ahmaud Arbery happened, he just came out very, very forcefully and vocally. Anytime he was in front of a camera or a microphone or a notepad, he was saying how Georgia needed to do this and Georgia needed to do it now. And I think that that was really the biggest turning point in Georgia for getting this across the finish line this year.
Great. Yeah, it's hard for I think the legislatures in the Georgia Capitol to ignore the noise and the banging of the protests on the streets happening at their front doors, kind of looking for something to happen. I should have mentioned this from the outside. I apologize. Gene from Coca-Cola is on the line with us. He is not on video, so a couple of you have mentioned you can't see him. He is here with us. He is just in a place with very little internet access, so working on the phone line. But Gene is, you know, you represent a very important part of this story, I think. You know, why did Coca-Cola decide to weigh in support of a hate crimes bill? And what role do you see of the business community in the movement of the bill?
Allison, am I off mute?
You're on, Gene. Let's see. You know what? Maybe we will come back.
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
Hey,
Great.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hey, thank you. And I too apologize that I'm not on video with the rest of the folks on the Zoom call. I have the similar challenges that Maya has, so I apologize in advance. And I also want to thank Allison and our friends at ADL for inviting us to participate in this important conversation. And when we got the invitation, we jumped at the opportunity. And I'm answering your question now. It's essentially, you know, Coca-Cola has a long history of engaging on important social issues for decades. It's a fabric of our company, our brand, and our people. So it was an easy decision to jump in, and we've been supportive in the past. And as you alluded to, Maya, this legislation was introduced several times, but it was passed the House last year and was, you know, pending in the Senate. A lot of people don't realize that. But and to Governor Barnes' point, Speaker Ralston should get a tremendous amount of credit for his leadership in pushing this for years. And then for us, for Coca-Cola, I mentioned, you know, fabric of our company and our people and our brands. If you look back at our leaders, Robert Woodruff, who ran our company for about 50 plus years, Roberto Goizueta in the 80s and early 90s, and then most recently our chairman and CEO, James Quincy, have all been very vocal in support of our position on social issues and inclusion, et cetera. So it's an easy thing for us to do, and for me personally as well. The hate crimes bill is important to Georgia. It's important to bring our community together. And we felt like we wanted to lead in that regard. And so we engaged directly on the legislation. Our president of North America, Jim Dinkins, reached out to Ryan and Ryan Guthrie, who's on the call with me as well, over the weekend prior to the session going back in, and said, what can I do? What can I do to help get this over the finish line? And so we said, well, you know, thank you, you can stand by, but we suggest you write letters to the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker, urging for passage of House Bill 426 as written. I think Governor Barnes referenced that earlier as written. That was an important part of it. And then we engaged at the direct level as far as direct lobbying, et cetera. And then our associates engaged as well, both direct contact with state legislators, but then they themselves organized a march from our world headquarters on North Avenue down to the Capitol, and we thought that that was very effective as well. So those are primary reasons why we did it and kind of what we did in short.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to ask kind of all three of you, you know, ADL has been told for many, many years that we could have passed a hate crimes law in Georgia that just protected race and religion, and we could add the other categories later when people were ready. So obviously we landed at a better place because we got a much more inclusive bill. But throughout the legislative process, there were other categories that were discussed that did not end up in the final law. I wanted you all to kind of talk a little bit about the inclusivity of the bill and how its path here was important in the ultimate outcome. Jean, you want to start?
Sure. So the LGBTQ inclusion was critical for the success of the bill passing. Frankly, the Coca-Cola company would not have supported the bill without the inclusion of that language. So that's kind of where our position is on that.
Yeah. Governor, you got to unmute. There we go.
There you go. I'll add to that also. I think you probably could have passed. I had the same problem back in 2000. I could have passed just with race and religion, but I think that fails to fully anticipate and fully include everyone in this diverse state. I mean, we're in some parts of this state, we are as rural as Montana. In the Atlanta region, we are as diverse as New York. And I think that it would have been a mistake. And in fact, it was what we talked to Allison about. This is the time to include everything that's in it. There is no use in having a half-baked bill, because it's when they're through with this, they're going to say, I don't want to take that up for another so many years. And it just pushes it down the road. And I think that was very important. And I will say this to follow up on what Jean has said. Coca-Cola always has been a leader in our social issues. Bob Woodruff helped to integrate the public schools in Georgia, for example, at a time when the debate at the General Assembly was whether we were going to close the public schools because the federal courts had ordered integration. And Coca-Cola leads the business community here in this state because of their history and because of how everybody respects Coca-Cola. You know, we call Coca-Cola the Southern wine, and everybody, you don't drink soda pop and soda drinks in Georgia, you drink Coca-Colas, as it's called. But when Coca-Cola came into this effort unabashedly, it was a signal to the other business community, you better get on board. And I think, and when I was governor, I always thought this was very true. You have to have good business support to controversial issues if you want to make sure that it gets done. And unless you build that partnership, it's difficult to push a controversial issue, social issue through. Coca-Cola was a big supporter when we took the Confederate battle flag off. And the business community came together when we did all of that. And Coca-Cola taking that leadership role was, in my view, one of the real turning points and signals to all the business community. This is important for you, it's important for us, it's important for the state.
I think you're right, Governor. I mean, we worked really closely with our coalition in very close partnership with the entire business community, like Coca-Cola, through the Chambers of Commerce, and it was really a joint effort that gave some, I think, important leverage as the bill kind of had some categories removed, gender was removed at one point, and we pushed very hard on that. And then there were some other categories that were inserted that many people, including ADL, were very unhappy about. You know, I'd love for somebody, you know, first responders was almost included in the bill, and that was fairly problematic and complicated, and did get removed towards the end. Why was that problematic? Like, why would that have been an issue in a hate crimes bill?
I'll jump in on this. So in watching the debate for this, because you know I followed this from the time the bill was filed, every hearing, floor debate, and when first responders were added to the legislation, that is probably one of the most emotional debates that I saw throughout this entire process for this bill, where you're in a Senate committee hearing and Senator Bill Cowsert is presenting the bill with the changed language, and you have Senator Harold Jones questioning him about this inclusion, and he asked him, you know, why are we here? Why is there a need to pass hate crimes legislation? And Senator Cowsert mentioned things like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, where while it wasn't a police officer, it was a former police officer who was involved in Ahmaud Arbery's death. And Harold Jones said, we're here because oftentimes when crimes are committed against Black people and Black men that could be considered hate crimes, they are done at the hands of law enforcement. And to add them as a protected class to this bill when we already have legislation on the books that enhances penalties for people who assault police officers, he was visibly frustrated to the point where when that bill passed with that language in it in committee, after in the press gaggle, you know, he was on the verge of tears. He was so upset by that language. And you saw the same type of comments made the next day, because we came in on a Saturday, and Senator David Lucas went to the well and was also fighting tears, just saying, like, this is not the time, this is not the legislation that police needs to be included. And somehow through those conversations, we got to a place where they took it out of that bill and they did, you know, pass separate legislation. I saw a comment in the chat about that. They passed a separate piece of legislation that did extend protections to first responders. The governor hasn't signed that bill yet. And there have been tons of issues raised about the practical implications of how that bill will be used. For example, I wrote a story the day after session adjourned about the day after the governor signed hate crimes legislation, where the ACLU raised an issue with having, making this new offense of bias motivated intimidation of a first responder, where if someone is convicted of that, they would get 1 to 5 years. And so the argument that they made is that, so now you could kill a police officer in theory and be sentenced to 1 to 5 years because this law exists, and because of the rule of lenity, you have to consider the more lenient penalty. So there are just all these questions that people have about the implications of this bill. You know, the governor rushed to sign the hate crimes bill so that it would go into effect July 1. He hasn't signed this one yet, and so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I totally agree with everything.
And if I could add,
oh, go ahead, Gene, please.
I just say, if I could add, digress real quickly back to the LGBTQ inclusion language. I believe now it's the first time sexual orientation has been written into the Georgia Constitution. So that's momentous, to say the least. As it relates to the first responders language inclusion, it would have killed the bill. Because opposition to the language, the Democratic support would have evaporated immediately. The coalition that was strongly for House Bill 426 was very diverse. From a community and business standpoint, we had Metro Atlanta Chamber, Georgia Chamber, you guys at ADL, Georgia Equality, NAACP. I'm pretty confident we would have walked away from that piece of legislation had it stayed in there.
Agree 100%.
And the other challenge we had, of course, was the timing. I mean, we were under the gun. There was only 4 days left, et cetera, in the session, and the clock was ticking. So to change the bill that dramatically and to have that debate go back into the House would have effectively killed the bill in my mind.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, there was a lot of anger when first responders were included. There were some other problematic categories included as well, but first responders was troubling. With ADL, we've always caused issues with employment categories trying to be inserted into a hate crimes bill. Employment is not an immutable characteristic, something you cannot or should not have to change about yourself. And we always thought it kind of dilutes the impact of like real identity-based crimes. I'm going to ask one more question before we kick it over to Q&A. There's some really great questions in the chat, so thank y'all. Keep them coming. Governor Barnes kind of talked in the beginning about the strong bipartisan support of this bill. The bill always had strong bipartisan sponsors of the bill. I'm not sure if we can really say there was bipartisan support of the bill last year, or even at the beginning of this year. Why do you think the bill in the end did have such strong bipartisan support, and why do you think that was so important?
Well, I'll start off with that. One of the things I will say is that there's an old saying in politics, 24 hours is an eternity in politics. And that's also true in legislation, and it showed this. What changed this was, the terrible things that we were seeing on videotape and, iPhones and everything else that was occurring. And I think there was a little bit of, remorse that we, and guilt that this hadn't been taken care of before. And before it had been just a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, we're not going to criminalize thought. That was always the thing on the other side. And now that you were seeing that, listen, actually out there is some hatred and some harm aimed at specific people. People felt guilty about that. Hank Williams, I think it was, had an old song that says, don't believe your lying eyes. And when folks began to see George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and all the others, they said, it was shocking to them. And then they began to say to themselves, am I a part of this? Am I a part of this? And to show you how it has changed, of course, Allison knows this, but in the original passage of the bill in the House last year, it was a close vote. It takes 91 votes to pass, and I think it got 95 or 96, something like that. So it was not a runaway. But when it came back from the Senate with the data provision added, it passed overwhelmingly. And I went through the list to see who had changed their vote. And there were some rural folks that changed, most of them did not. But in the suburban areas, several that had voted against it last year voted for the bill. In fact, they wanted an opportunity to vote for the bill this year. And so that's what happens. I mean, when there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. I know that's not original, but I forgot who said it. But the idea had come, and it had come because it was kind of like the Vietnam War. When you began to see actual people getting killed on the 6 o'clock news, it was different than reading about it in the newspaper. And when you began to see these incidents on television, that were real time in many aspects, it had an effect. And there was a lot of remorse, in my view, of somebody saying, why did I vote against this? You know. So that's my view on what happened in that regard.
Great. Jean or Maya, anything to add?
I would say seeing, unfortunately, seeing the deaths of people on video is not new to 2020. We've been seeing these for years and action hasn't happened. And I know that Senator Cowsert got some pushback when he said this on the floor, but I think that this pandemic has slowed everyone down to the point where they could actually process the visuals that they were seeing of the deaths of oftentimes Black men, and it could affect them. They couldn't turn away. And I think that had a lot to do with what changed between when the House voted in 2019 and when the Senate took it up in 2020. And it's sad to say it's not the fact that these men died. That's not what it was, because these cases like these have been happening for years, but it was the fact that they couldn't just go on with their life. They were still, and they had to come to terms with and process what that actually meant. And Senator Cowsert, again, said on the floor where he heard the quote where it's like, if you're not actively doing something to make this better, you're part of the problem. And he said, to hear that hurt him. And I think that is probably what, to speak to what Governor Barnes said, caused a lot of folks who might have voted against this last year to think about things differently this year.
Yeah. I just want to jump on that also.
And I would add.
Oh, go ahead, Jean.
Can I add one
Yes.
thing? Because that Governor Barnes and Maya have covered quite a bit, and I agree with 100% what they said. The other thing I would add, it's kind of the obvious, is that the legislature heard us. They heard from us from the top to the bottom. Grassroots efforts were very strong, very diverse. I've got some quick stats I got from my friends from the Metro Atlanta Chamber related to the broad coalition, that we engaged more than 26,000 Georgians on the bill in the last week, 65,000 page views of the PassHateCrimesGeorgia.com website, 4,500 emails were sent to legislators, 80,000 targeted texts went to key people in key districts, resulting in about 1,000 plus texts to legislators on the morning of the Senate vote. And that's just kind of what we were able to capture. So there's more than that. But my point is that I think they heard us. I mean, I know there's a lot of things at stake here, a lot of variables, but I truly believe that they heard from us, and that changed a lot of people's point of view as well.
I think that's a really important point. I heard actually before the Lieutenant Governor kind of proposed a new version of the bill, that in a single weekend, he got over 10,000 emails about the hate crimes bill. So I think there was a lot of energy. I think there was also some really key timing. So our hate crimes bill passed the House, and so was sitting in the Senate, as Governor Barnes explained, which meant that this was something that could get done in 11 days, right? And so this was something that those who had remorse and those who wanted to take action could take action with. But I'll also say these were the moments that, leaning into our coalition, and especially our partners like the NAACP and Georgia Equality and the Chambers of Commerce, was so important, because we all kind of agreed that this was the thing we have to do now, but this is not the end, right? This has got to kind of lead to more. And we're all looking forward to kind of bringing on more change at ADL. So I am now going to kick it over to my colleague, Deb Leipzig, who is going to help us sift through all of these questions in the chat. Thank y'all. These are really great.
Thank you, Allison. And yeah, the chat is absolutely popping, which is fantastic. But I want to make sure that I mention the other thing that's coming up in the chat is just what an extraordinary accomplishment this really is. And thanking everyone on our panel for the work that they've done to support it, to report on it, and to help this legislation get passed. And so I really want to extend that. I know I'm super proud to have played a tangential role with ADL and of Allison specifically. So thank you all for that. I just want to make sure that we mention that. I was also going to try and say y'all, but I just don't think I can pull it off as an East Coaster. It's just not my thing. It's just not believable. All righty then. So, you know, this is a national call, and as you might imagine, we've got people from around the country on this call. So what do you have to say for folks who are still living in a state that have not yet passed this kind of hate crime law? What can they do to sort of follow in Georgia's footsteps? Allison, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I think what was really key for us is we spent a lot of time talking with a very wide diversity of voices before we got to the place of needing to pass a bill. So we had kind of brought together law enforcement and the business community and advocates and legislators from both sides of the aisle very early on to talk about kind of how we could all come together and what our compromises would be. And so the bill that was proposed, HB 426 last year, is not something that just popped up in a day. It's something that kind of lived and breathed for a while and was the result of great compromise and kind of all the voices coming together, so that when we did get to the place of June, like Jean said, you know, our noise was harmonious and strong and very coordinated. And so I think that that sent a really loud message to those who were in charge of creating our structures. I'd be curious also what Gene would say here. I know he's got some interest in the other states as well, which I am also. My region covers South Carolina.
Gene, jump on in.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, I think Arkansas, South Carolina, Wyoming, and to a degree Indiana, because it doesn't have the LGBTQ language in it, are the states that need work. And we are actively engaged in those states to hopefully make change happen. You know, Georgia is unique to us because it's our home and we're headquartered there, but we are fortunate enough to you know, have all those other states as communities that are critical to us. Our local bottlers and the whole Coca-Cola system is, you know, ubiquitous to most of the U.S. and the globe. And so, for example, our president of Coca-Cola North America, as he asked, what can I do? And once the Georgia bill passed, he came back and said, all right, what's next? What are the next, what can I do in the other states that don't have this? So, you know, active engagement, getting involved, contacting your legislators, kind of the obvious kind of, you know, poli-sci 101, but creating a broad coalition that has a specific ask, I think would be hugely helpful. You don't want fractions, you know, pushing for this language and that language. You got to come to agreement on one piece of legislation and go for it. But you have to have the local government and local business support in order to do that. So we will work with our customers and our bottlers in those respective states to help push this legislation forward.
Can I add one more thing, Deb?
Please.
You know, several people along the way gave me the same bit of advice, which is movement is good. The goal is just to keep things moving in the right direction. If they get derailed, it's okay, just keep moving. Don't let political will die. And so one strategy that we've taken over the past few years is while we wait for some of our states to kind of come around, there have been some local grassroots efforts in many cities, especially throughout South Carolina, some in Georgia, and in Little Rock, Arkansas, just passed a local hate crimes ordinance earlier this week. Charleston, Columbia, Greenville, Hilton Head all have local ordinances, several cities in Georgia. And so there is this kind of way that everybody can have impact and a voice in this and kind of contribute to the process continuing to move forward.
I love that. Everybody can have a voice in this process. Before we move on, Maya or Governor Barnes, is there anything you'd like to add? All right. So let's keep going. We've gotten a bunch of questions that I really want to ask along the lines of, can you speak to, in very much layman's terms, what is this bill accomplishing? What is it now protecting that wasn't protected before? Can you talk about the practicalities of what this bill means? Allison, why don't we start with you again?
So I think Jean made one point that I just want to re-emphasize because it's a very important point, that this is the first law in Georgia that codifies protections to the LGBT community. And that is something that is not going by lightly. That is a big, big deal. So, you know, now we know that crimes committed against people based on bias, motivation, based on their identities, these crimes will be tried differently. They will be recognized differently, and entire communities will understand that those crimes will hit them in a different way. You know, we can think back about Dylan Storm Roof in Charleston, or the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. I mean, there's so many different examples, and how those crimes really impacted people across the nation. And naming the hate is just so crucial to communities and their response to what happens. And we're living in times where people's voices really matter, I think. And I think the noise and the impact on individuals can really reverberate.
Let me add one thing there too,
Please.
if I could. I think it's very important that leaders, political leaders, stand up and say, listen, we're not going to allow this anymore. And it's the easiest path for a legislator or even a governor is just to let things knock along, because it takes political capital. And don't think that there's a utopia out there. There'll be a backlash against this, just like there's a backlash against everything. But there is real hate out there. I guess as I get older and my hair turns white and turns loose, that I recognize it more and more. And it's disturbing for me. It has gotten worse over the years. And I think that one of the greatest advantages for this, for the passage of this bill, is not necessarily the enhanced penalties, but the message that is sent is, listen, we're leaders in this community and we are willing to consume political capital to do what's right. And to say that we're not going to allow hate to rule us. And I think that is very important. I mean, when we took the Confederate battle flag off, I remember there was a pastor up on Peachtree Street of the Presbyterian Church, and he came down and with a group of other pastors and stood with me when we had a news conference. And the next week, a brick got thrown through their plate glass window at the church. And I went to a synagogue out in DeKalb County while I was governor that had been defaced with anti-Semitic, and and then the gay hatred was very high at the time. 20 years ago. So I think this is very important, and Allison is correct. The LGBTQ relationship is very important, particularly for a state like Georgia. Georgia is a conservative state, and I hope that this is the harbinger of better things that can be done for the state. Whether you're Republican or Democrat. We may get elected as Republicans and Democrats, but we serve in state government as Georgians. And I think we've gotten away from that, and what was good feeling that I saw was for all the polarization we have, a statement against hate at this time arose from a bipartisan coalition. And I think that message may be greater than any enhanced punishment.
Thank you.
I would agree with the governor and Maya. One thing I would add is, yeah, I mean, the technical components of this bill are very, very important. Words do matter in legislation or letters or emails, et cetera. They do matter, but the symbolism of the passage of this bill is as important, and the timing of it is as important as the language in it. And I know Governor Barnes just touched on that, but I just wanted to echo on that from my perspective. And the bipartisan support shows that it has staying power. There are many bills that pass along party lines, and they're challenged legally or challenged with amendments or repeal efforts, et cetera. This was a very strong vote, and I think that was equally important.
And then I'll kind of talk the mechanics of it. So the protected classes are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender, mental disability, or physical disability. And so if you are convicted of a crime and found to have been motivated by hate against one of those protected classes, if it's a misdemeanor of simple assault, simple battery, criminal trespass, or misdemeanor theft, they can add, a judge can, if the jury finds beyond a reasonable doubt that you were motivated by hate for that, a judge can decide to add 6 to 12 months to your sentence or up to $5,000 fine. And for a felony, it's at least 2 years to your sentence and a $5,000 fine. And then just to go back to the question before, Deb, about what other states can do. I worked for the Post and Courier in Charleston, covering the Statehouse in Columbia for a while. And I was there, I was in South Carolina in 2015 when Dylan Roof went to the Emmanuel AME in Charleston. And I remember saying, I did a podcast, the South Carolina, their ETV podcast, talking about this bill. And I was asked, what will it take in South Carolina for this to get done? And I think it's probably occupational hazard, in that I am much more skeptical than probably a lot of my colleagues on this panel. When in 2015, South Carolina's response to the death of 9 Black parishioners was to remove a flag. Now, not to say that the symbolism of the flag wasn't important, but does it have the same impact as passing a hate crimes bill? Who knows? So I think what I said on that podcast was, if Emmanuel didn't do it, I don't know what will. Georgia had Ahmaud Arbery, not to be, cynical, but I don't know what it will take. I think politically in South Carolina, the bills are typically introduced by Democrats in a Republican-run legislature. I think it was important that Republicans were the ones to introduce these bills, because Democrats introduced sometimes verbatim bills, but it was the bills sponsored by Republicans that got traction. So, I mean, those are, being the cynical journalist, those are the kind of things that I saw that helped the bill get across the finish line in Georgia that haven't been done in South Carolina.
Thank you for adding that. I think there's nothing wrong with some healthy skepticism. It's probably good for everybody.
Deb, can I add one more thing that I don't think we've talked about? We talked about why first responders shouldn't be included in the bill, but we haven't talked about how important law enforcement are in hate crimes. And in the passage of the hate crimes bill, I should say, ADL trains tens of thousands of law enforcement every year on hate crimes and other issues. And every training I have done with law enforcement, and when I explain what a hate crime is, they are 100% on board and thrilled to know about this tool that they can use to report on people's identities, that can help them build relationships, that can help them kind of up their community status. And so law enforcement have always been a big part of advocacy for the hate crimes bill, and they are widely supported. So it's a really interesting and important partnership, because they're the ones kind of affected with the data collection.
I think that's a really reasonable point, Allison. Thank you for making it. I want to be mindful of time, and we only have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of you to quickly say what you think is next for Georgia. What's next? What comes next? What's the next big thing? Where do we go from here? So Maya, let's start with you.
So I would say we have seen actually yesterday, I want to say yesterday, the next thing that Representative Chuck Estration, who is the sponsor of the hate crimes bill in the House, has put on the agenda hearings to talk about the state's citizens arrest law. So the House is going to begin hearings, virtual hearings, Zoom hearings next week to discuss citizens arrest. I know that a lot of Democrats have talked about the need to repeal citizens arrest in Georgia, the need to repeal stand your ground in Georgia, and several police reform pieces that they want to pass. I think in a Republican-controlled legislature, I think citizens arrest might be something that's more appealing to get some movement over, stand your ground. Because I wrote about some mayors writing a letter to the legislature asking them to take up stand your ground next. And whenever I write about guns, the emails I get, and they are very vocal, very powerful lobby in Georgia and in the country. So I don't know how far something like that would get, but I think there might be some room for citizens arrest laws to get a closer look next.
Great, thank you. Governor Barnes, to you, a quick answer. What's next for Georgia?
Well, I think Maya's hit it. I think you might do away with the citizens arrest. And I've been practicing law over almost 50 years, and I started off as a prosecutor. I've never seen the necessity for citizens arrest. I just be quite frank with you. Most of the times I've ever seen it, it has other motivations. I do agree with Maya too that there needs to be a re-examination of the stand your ground. I mean, nobody disagrees in the South that you can't stand your ground, but you can do that without shooting them. I mean, I just don't understand why the law was very well established. If you felt that there was no way to escape and that your life was being threatened, that was then you could use deadly force. But this business about stand your ground just encourages folks to wear guns into the McDonald's and look for an excuse. But I agree with Maya that will be very difficult. So I think Maya's scheduled kind of summarized it. I do think there's another place too. Of course, I don't want to get off on this, but I do think there needs to be an open discussion about the fact that the South was wrong in committing treason and seceding from the country and then glorifying it. And that gets back to race, and it's the third rail in Georgia politics and probably politics in the nation. I think it'd be good for the state to have an open discussion, and in that is the issue about Confederate memorials and things like that. I think that's a much more difficult task.
Well, I must say all these next steps sure do sound easy. Jean, how about you? What do you think the next steps are for Georgia?
Real quick, I know we're running out of time. I wanted to peek back and call out Senate Bill 288 that passed this year, and we supported that too, and that expands the expungement eligibility for certain misdemeanors if that individual is clear after 4 years. And we worked with the Georgia Justice Project. It had bipartisan support. I believe it passed the House unanimously. So that's one thing I just wanted to echo as additional positive action this year. And looking ahead at that, Governor Barnes and Maya covered it from a legislative standpoint. I'd say for CocaCola, I mentioned that Robert Woodruff and Roberto Cazueta and now James Quincy are leaders of note in this space. James Quincy wrote, what does the Coca-Cola Company stand for on social justice? June 3rd, you can look it up. I know we're running out of time, but in essence, it was listen, empower, invest, and network. And so it's not just legislation, it's what businesses and communities can do to move forward in a positive sense.
Thank you, Jean. All right, Allison, questions to you.
I'll make it quick. I totally agree with Maya. We've got some work to do on citizens arrest. I think we also have a lot of work to do in Georgia on voting access. So I think that's an important piece here too.
Oh, well, thanks to all of you for joining us here today. And what was, I mean, it was informative, it was impressive. What a great conversation that we had. We're grateful for all of you to take the time to have been here. And thank you to everybody who's joined us on the call today for participating in Fighting Hate from Home. Keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be telling you more about the next Fighting Hate from Home. That'll be happening 2 weeks from today. All right, take good care and stay safe.
Thank you.